The US government has come to the conclusion that open source data or commercial data is valuable. But what they tend to do is buy entire data sets in its entirety, ingest it, and do that over and over and over again. And that's just not sustainable. We need to do things differently because the next conflict is going to be very different than the last 20 years. And so it's not just enough to say, hey, commercial data is valuable. We need to query the data where it sits and just get the slices of data that we need.
Hey, this is Ryan Connell with the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office, joined here today with Sammy Semwangu. Sammy, how you doing?
Doing excellent. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, appreciate you being on. I'll turn it over to you. Just give a quick introduction to yourself.
Awesome. Well, Sammy Semwangu, I am CEO of Bazze. We are an intelligence targeting and early warning platform. National security customers use Bazze to know everything about a person, place, or thing using commercial data and paying on a consumption basis.
Got it. That's awesome. And how long give me the background on that. Is it recent? Are you startup world? Where are you?
For sure. It feels like all parts of my life have kind of led up to this moment, I suppose. But, the TLDR is, I spent a decade in national security. And after that, started my first company, made every mistake known to mankind. Was fortunate enough to work at a second company called the Red Owl, run by Guy Filippelli, and went through the acquisition process. And that gave me the strength to go back out and start the entrepreneurial journey again in 2019. And our kind of view of the world was that, and remains, 99.9% of stored data is unclassified out here in the world. And, a tiny sliver, is in the classified spaces. And therefore, the US government should be using all this data out here before it uses its scarce resources, its truly unique capabilities to answer policymaker questions. And so we said, well, we should build a company that enables, the US and her allies to better leverage the data that's already out there. And so that was kind of the aha moment that led us to founding Bazze and leads us today.
Got it. And in terms of maturity, are there users of your platform already?
Oh, yeah. So we work closely with U.S. defense intelligence customers, as well as, AUKUS writ large, so Australia and the UK, and intend to expand beyond there. And so we're a team of soon to be 11. We've gone through, the SBIR journey, which we can talk about. We've raised a seed round, and it's been all to say we are incredibly bullish on our future and the unique model that we have, and there's just much to come.
Yeah, I love that. I think before we even get into Bazze, you mentioned something right at the intro. I'd love to just tap your brain about making every mistake known to mankind in the startup world. Is there something that comes to mind that's worth sharing for the listeners that may be on a similar journey on their first startup that you might be able to protect them against?
I don't know if I can protect them against it, but I think some critical pieces. The problem I chose for the first company, I was not the best person for that. It was a good problem, but looking back on it and being honest, that wasn't the thing. The second, team is so important. With the current team that we have, they're amazing. We've been small and just the output is tremendous. And that is something that when I compare the first to the second time, the team we've been able to put together has been tremendous. And then the third part is just market dynamics. The first idea I had, it was a secure networking business. It was interesting, but there was no tailwind really kind of carrying the company through. And so much different now, defense spending globally is increasing for a variety of factors. And so that is just another element of, building a company in that slipstream is just a very different feeling. And so those are kind of three things I can think of right now that are very different.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, and it's certainly novel sounding to me, an idea of leveraging all of the commercial data that's available. And I think, I'm an acquisitions background, right? So I think through all of the direction that we have in the department and frankly the federal government of how we do acquisitions and procurement of leveraging commercial first, and of certain you would think that would apply to all other aspects of the world in terms of leveraging what's available before you're spending resources on it. What's that like for you? Is data acquisition the right word? But how are you acquiring all of the commercial data, or is it open source?
And so this is our major differentiator. So the U.S. government has come to the conclusion that open source data or commercial data is valuable. But what they tend to do is buy entire data sets in its entirety, ingest it, and do that over and over and over again, essentially trying to buy the entire internet and put it on the high side. And that's just not sustainable. To answer our most important questions consistently well, we don't need tens or hundreds. We also need thousands, tens of thousands of data sources to comb through to connect the dots. As you can imagine, that is just not sustainable. And there are organizations that have spent far more than they anticipated just on cloud costs alone.
Sure.
And so it's not just enough to say, hey, commercial data is valuable. We need to query the data where it sits and just get the slices of data that we need. And so what we have done is think of it as like a super API. It's this platform. And we've created these soda straws into now 24 plus data vendors. And so you can ask a question. What do we, I want to know more about this email, this phone number. Here's a photo of a person. Tell me who that is, what they're saying online, and that enables U.S. forces abroad to say, understand the risk of someone who is sticking out, in a given situation. And so the value is, you ask that question, we federate that query out to, dozens of data vendors and automate the analytical process to produce an exquisite insight in a few minutes, whereas before, that would take weeks, if not months, and, thousands of dollars more to do the same thing.
Sure. No, that's super interesting. I'm curious if you have perspective on, so like OpenAI just released like their $200 a month, like really competitive, I should say really competitive, really aggressive modeling. And with that comes like the deep research, I think it's called, model, which has some capability of just like searching the world and coming back in a consolidated response. How do you view yourself compared to that? Is it different because of your specific mission set and like the purpose behind the intel? Like OpenAI is not going to touch something like that. Like how do you compete with the big guys, if that makes sense, in that type of environment?
It's an amazing capability and something that we learn as it comes out. I think the major differentiation there is it's searching the internet, what's out there. We are enabling our customers to access, proprietary data sets. So think of satellite imagery,
Sure.
Or identity graph data, you name it. So this is not data that's just kind of out there to be crawled. It's highly valuable, curated, high quality data that enables our customers to answer, these questions, in a very timely manner.
Sure. No, that makes sense. I was going to move on to potentially your journey going through some of the DoD acquisition stuff, but anything that you want to hit before we do that related to the tech and how the company's operating?
Well, I think that'll kind of come out as we go forward. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's do it. All right. So you mentioned offline two buzzwords, well, maybe more than two, but SBIR and Valley of Death. So I'm assuming you have some experience going through the OSD SBIR process. What was that like?
Yeah. And my general takeaway is the SBIR process is a great process, and people should, young entrepreneurs or rather folks just getting started in the national security space should pursue SBIR funding. Just know what it is. And I would think of it as almost R&D dollars that will go to zero once the contract ends. And so it's kind of cheaper cost of capital is the way I generally think about it. Now, not all SBIRs are created equal, but I think that's a fair kind of in the main. We, in 2019, got a SBIR phase 2 through the U.S. Air Force and in partnership with Special Operations Command. And the top line is, we worked incredibly closely with the end user. We developed the product together and deployed it to the field just in a matter of months, used in operations. And the value that we were delivering was this commercial data was helping our customer overcome the tyranny of distance by leveraging commercial data. So they no longer had to fly an expensive drone to go over somewhere. They could use already gathered commercial data to understand what was going on the ground. Incredibly powerful. We briefed it up, to the senior leadership, who, thumbs up, looks great. And as you know, in the government, people tend to rotate every 2 to 3 years, or every year to 3 years. It really depends. Sure. You never know. Sure. And our champions PCS'd or changed their role within the command, midway through the contracting process. And with that, so went all our momentum, because these budgeting processes are complex with multiple stakeholders. So even something that seems to be highly valuable, if you're not there pushing the piece of paper all the way down the hallway every day, it just can get lost in the mix. And as someone who's just getting, used to the defense acquisitions process, I really didn't know that we were kind of dead in the water until, far too late. And so that was part of my journey in the SBIR.
Interesting. Yeah. Cause I mean, it makes sense, right? Like I get it. Like I can, or maybe I have empathy is the best way to describe it. Like I'm thinking, gosh, if I come into a new organization through some sort of rotation and I'm told I have a $10 million budget, and I looked at my predecessor who had kind of earmarked where that money might go. Of course I'm going to read it, but I'm also still excited to own something. And like, I have my own ideas, right? And like, so you kind of get how that process, makes that difficult, right? Yeah, there's some things and continuing to add visibility to like the statute of SBIR and understanding that we can award contracts to SBIR solutions or derive from SBIR solutions without further competition is something that isn't overly used or understood, is probably the best way to say it. And you just have that inherent acquisition knowledge and program or need that you're describing kind of float away when the person leaves with it. And so that's the valley of death story.
Well, no, it goes after. Right. So all to say, the takeaway out from the valley of death was we were so excited. We got $2 million, and it was a lot of money, and we're a small team, and we deliver for the customer, we get the approval, and we think we're off to the races. Phase 3 and program of record and all sorts of things. It just really seems to be lined up. And I think if I were to go back and do it again, I would have given the team more at-bats to be successful, meaning that, we were delivering for the SBIR end user, but also leveraging that work to find additional customers who would have also been interested in funding. This is an obvious statement, but, when you're a young team and you have this really engaged end user that's big, you just, you want to keep the main thing as you hear, or whatever the case may be, and you want to just kill it for them. But just know it's a single point of failure, right? And so if I were to do it over again, I would have sought out other organizations directly, and sister organizations, if you will. And then I would have gone and created more partnerships with, integrators who are already working with, my target customer, such that, if they already are on contract and they could, leverage what we're building, then that's something where everyone can win. And so that would be a piece of guidance, in starting a company. SBIR funding is good to go after because it gets you in the door and, gets you used to the government role, way of doing things if you haven't done it. And, you can take that and then bring it to other folks to say, hey, here's what we're doing and how we could be valuable to you. And ultimately it could be a launching pad, even if that SBIR process itself does not lead to recurring revenue.
Sure. I'm curious if you're comfortable sharing. Did your Air Force SBIR lead to some of the success you have now, or are those kind of separate?
Indirectly. Yeah, it died a very painful and long death, and it was really hard, to say the least. So we had grown the team, and then we had to shrink the team, and for a bit it was myself and 2 junior engineers. But what we had was a really solid platform to build upon, and what gave us faith in staying with it was that people were saying, hey, this is really useful. This is, whereas my first company, I kept running it in the face of people saying, I don't really want to use this thing. Sure. I learned from that. And so then we, from that, the proof of concept we ran during the SBIR, which was positively received. And then as we were having other customer conversations, they said, hey, don't die. Just stay alive. So, as a young company, just keep going, and then we'd get like 40 grand here, 50 grand there. And so, after conclusion of the SBIR, we just kind of hopped from lily pad to lily pad as a small company, just kind of build our capability. And as that process would have it, in a year's time, we started getting much, larger contracts from a handful of customers. And we're like, oh, okay, here we are. And so I think one of the things about, we have a view of the market. And if the goal is to, for the U.S. government to kind of know what's going on everywhere at all times, like if that's like the ISR goal in layperson speak, essentially, then our conclusion was there's no other way to get to that than leveraging data that's already being collected and querying the data where it sits. Every other model falls by the wayside. And so I guess with that clarity of the market, we just had a lot of faith that, hey, well, let's just stick to this and it's going to prove out. And as time has evolved, that has proven ever more true. Admittedly, the United States, we're large. We got oceans on either side. We're kind of slow to things until something bad happens, and then we move faster than anyone else. It tends to be the way it goes, unfortunately. Our allies, who are smaller and admittedly closer to the fight than we are from a proximity perspective, they are, in fact, kind of leading a lot of this technological change in a way I think the U.S. is catching up. And so our collaboration with our AUKUS allies has demonstrated, the ability to leverage commercial data, pay only for the data that you're using, and not have to ingest massive amounts of stuff you don't need, is proving real value, particularly when budgets are increasingly, under pressure.
Sure. It almost makes too much sense when you said it earlier, like the idea that, like, I would make up the numbers, but 99.5% of the data is in a unclassed public setting, and 0.5 of the data is, being gathered through intel methods. If you only rely on the latter, you're just ignoring 99.5% of information that may or may not be relevant, but if you don't query it, you don't know. Yeah, it's making a whole lot of sense to me as you're describing it.
Well, it just goes, the world has changed very quickly. And that empathy for our brothers and sisters in government, it takes a bit to kind of catch up to just how fast the data space has evolved. And so there's one piece. And then there's another element of, kind of incentives, right? And so since the National Security Act of 1947, these organizations have been doing business more or less the same way, and incentives have kind of built up over a long period of time. And so in the intelligence community, people get promoted for gathering secret data and then providing that to policymakers.
Sure.
So then when you go to the intelligence community, you say, hey, there's all this non-secret data that you should be using. It's a different frame of mind, to say the least. And so, I think folks are catching up to that new reality, and I know that they'll get there.
Now that you're in operation mode, you're executing, you've grown to 11 people. Like, what do you see as next 2 years in terms of, I'll say, tech adoption, scaling, maybe potential competition in this space? Like, I'm just curious what you kind of see as the next couple of years.
Well, talking about from the government perspective, we need to do things differently because the next conflict is going to be very different than the last 20 years.
Sure. An
example of that is, whether it's the IC or the DoD, they have to do much more of their work at the unclassified level. Heaven forbid, in a future conflict, we're going to be by, with, and through our allies, many of whom are not in the Five Eyes. So our ability to share timely information with them, it has to be unclassified. We can't go through the release process every time. And so to answer your question, on the government side, we anticipate that the U.S. government allies will be pushing a lot more of their work in the unclassified space. And that doesn't mean, without security. It's still going to be secure work, but just increasing the service area for commercial data such as Bazze to plug into the commercial to government infrastructure. Because right now everything's on the high side. And so whenever you talk to someone, they're like, I love this. How do I get this in a classified space? And my response is, you don't put it in the classified. You keep it
going the wrong way. Yeah.
You guys got to come down to us, and hang out here where the water is great. And so I think that is going to be a continued evolution for both the U.S. and particularly our Five Eye and NATO allies. we are incredibly excited about this, as you can imagine, as we're working, across all of these government organizations, and anticipate, our growth to be tremendous, as you will. Our goal for us is to how do we enable a new hire who doesn't have a ton of training to leverage all the data that we have, access to all the data vendors we work with. And so here at Bazze, and we're leveraging all these new AI models that keep popping out of the woodwork to enable someone to say, here's this photo, tell me everything about this person. And then we take that and we figure out who that person is. We see what they're saying online. We say where they live, where they work. And then the analyst can now make a risk assessment to say, okay, what do we do next?
Sure.
And right now that is a process that takes 10 tabs, on the high side and all sorts of, accesses and things. It's just a very painful process and a lot of cutting and pasting into Excel, and PowerPoint. And so we are automating that process so that, again, an untrained person can do that in a matter of minutes, as opposed to an expert in, hours or days.
Got it. I want to go back a little bit and poke at the SBIR thing, because something you said made me think about it. And I know part of the SBIR program and its intent is about commercialization. Your solution seems very IC military, DoD oriented. Have you had any experiences through this startup where SBIR pulled you into DoD, and then you had some non-military, non-government kind of pull you to the other side? Have you had any of that tension, or has it just been strictly DoD focused?
We are, focused on, government sales in general.
Yeah.
Got to be good at one thing before you go to the next. At the same time, we also work with international development agencies. We work with media. They're oftentimes asking the same questions. I think from a values perspective, we're all aligned. And so, though we are focused on, to answer the question, the IC in the DoD, we do, in some part support, other organizations also interested in this. And we do envision ultimately being a 50-50, commercial and government company. That's on the roadmap, but for now we're keeping it to government.
Got it. I'm just thinking, two thoughts. There's the private investigator side of things, and then there's security concerns, if that's the right way to say it. I don't know that me as a human wants someone else to just pay a set fee per month and they can find out everything about me.
And that's an incredibly important point. So everything we do, from building the product to who we work with, is driven by that exact concern around why are we doing this? Privacy, right? Is incredibly powerful capabilities. And so for that reason, we only work with government entities or contractors supporting the government. This is not something where you can just sign up online and pay a ticket and have at it. It also informs you how we access data. So in previous iterations of intelligence work, they have hoovered up massive amounts of data, right? We enable our customers just to pull the data that they need, as opposed to
makes sense.
That massive data set. And so, this conversation isn't like a one and done. It's a continual conversation that we have with folks like yourselves and internally to make sure that we're doing something that ultimately we're proud of.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Have you had any issues with, because you talked about bringing the data down to the unclass level? I know I've seen or experienced or heard of examples where data aggregation actually enhances the classification level. Is that something you've had to do? Meaning, I'll give you an example. If I have one proposal that has their bill of materials, all the pieces that go into the part, it's just CUI. If I have 1,000 of those, I now can piece together supply chain vulnerabilities that might actually take it from CUI to something higher. And with your data aggregation, is that something you've had to battle or had a concern with?
It's a conversation we've had over the years. Again, when one has only worked in the government space and then you look at the commercial world and you go, wow, that commercial data has SIG-int qualities. Sure. I think signals intelligence, NSA qualities to it. Let's have a conversation around that. I generally think if it's commercial data and you're doing the analysis in the commercial space, it should not be
Sure.
classified and hidden, right?
Yeah.
This seems to be kind of high. We already have a overclassification problem in the United States to begin with. And so I think that would be, I hear what you're saying, but I think it would be more problematic than helpful.
Got it. Understood. Cool. On the classification stuff, had a note from our conversation before we started about just like efficiencies in unclassified data. I know you talked a little bit about that so far. Anything else you want to bring up regarding the aggregation of unclassed data and all of that?
Yeah, I think, what I don't want to sound like is like government's dumb and they've been doing this way. Wow, can't they just see the future and adopt, right? A lot of the things that the U.S. and our allies, the way they do business is for good reason. And we can only look at, the Volt Typhoon, the Chinese hack of the telcos, and basically saw all the selectors or all the phone numbers that were of interest to U.S. government. So an intelligence bonanza, to say the least. And so that's why they like to keep things inside.
Sure.
And so that's just an example to why they do what they do. And so my general take is there are risks to this new business model, but we need to take new risks for the new conflict that we're preparing for. And so, we can apply, at several layers, steps to, safeguard our operations to the greatest extent possible and be effective on the battlefield, right? Like we can be super safe and do nothing and know nothing, or we can take new risks and give ourselves a chance to maintain our decision dominance, to use a popular word.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. No, this is a great conversation. I appreciate it. I want to leave you with the opportunity to just kind of, if you had any kind of high level takeaways, lessons learned, anything like that. If you were king for a day, or if you want to do something different, or whatever that looks like, just to kind of close out, but give the listeners something of a piece of advice.
Sure. I think of a couple of things. One, it's a really exciting time to be building a company in the national security space. I think there's just widespread appreciation for the fact that it's a dangerous world and we need to prepare for it and do things differently. And whether you're in government or outside trying to build something, I think we're all in agreement. So there's a incredible kind of force, impetus to do that. And so kind of a positive thing. And also the second part is, the U.S. government has tremendous capabilities that are not available in the outside world, in the form of its operatives, its hackers, its things that fly in the sky, all sorts of wonderful things, these exquisite capabilities. And we should appreciate that and know that like those resources should only be used against the hardest stuff. And that's really kind of like why I want to build this company, so that what government does best, we're really maximizing those capabilities. And so it's a kind of a positive story. And then to answer your question, if I were king for a day, kind of how do we get from here to there?
Sure.
We talk about innovation programs and technology and all this, but in the end, it really comes down to people. I know that sounds trite, but it's true. And it's how we incentivize folks on the ground who are making decisions day to day about how they run operations, how they acquire new technology, how they acquire data. And so, let's say in the intelligence world, the one change I would make, and this is a complex one, is I would incentivize the organizations to actually fill the intelligence gap and not run secret operations. It's a nuanced argument, but essentially people get promoted for running operations. Now, intelligence is an output of that, but they really get promoted for doing secret things. And so when you come to them with unclassified data, from an incentive perspective, that's not really going to get you promoted.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And so we should be focusing these organizations, throughout the chain of command, really focusing, hey, are we filling the intelligence gap? Whether it comes from commercial data or it comes from classified operation, doesn't matter. The important part is filling the gap. And I think that is, a way to, incentivize, again, folks from the line officers on up to be more effective.
That's super helpful. I would normally wrap here, but I do have one question based on what you said.
Sure.
I do. So you must know the answer to this, I just assume, but you talked about the, incentivizing the aggregation of unclassed data in order to fill the intel gap versus running an operation. I assume it's actually cheaper as well, like to aggregate unclassed data to answer the mail as opposed to orchestrating an operation.
100%. Just think about, pick our strategic competition, right? Russia and China. To run operations with respect to those countries is a tremendous, you have to find the right people, you have to train them for years, and then, make them effective over a long period of time with respect to really hard questions about the Politburo standing committees, policy plans, and intentions. Like, that's really hard. Then you think about, well, buying something that's already collected. That's a very, it's not an apples to apples necessarily, but you can get the idea of the scale. And so if we are going to find the right people and train them and put them in harm's way, let's make sure it's worth it.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, this was super insightful, Sammy. I really appreciate you coming on. This is a great conversation. So thank you.
Ryan, it's great to connect, and thank you for having me.